Now we want to look at how wage and price changes move the economy naturally back to full employment. Let's remember how we look at our economy in the short run and the long run. We've got three curves we're going to look at. One is the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the level of prices and the quantity of real GDP. Another is our aggregate supply curve, both in the short run, which is relatively flat, because it represents the idea that prices are relatively constant, and firms adjust production to meet demand. And we have the long run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical and reflects the idea in the long run that output is determined by factors of production and technology, or the production function. In other words, output is always going to be equal to potential output in the long run. Now when we look at these different curves, we can say something. If we look at the intersection of the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply curve, this is going to tell us how much actual output actually is at any point in time. That's how much we are producing at any point in time. If we look at the long run aggregate supply curve, that tells us how much potential output is. So we can see a situation where actual output is greater than potential output, or equal to potential output, or less than potential output. In the long run, we need to get to an equilibrium where actual output equals potential output. Let's see how that happens. Suppose we're in a situation like we show here in this graph, where the short run aggregate supply curve crosses the aggregate demand curve at point A. That implies that actual production is equal to Y0. As we can see in this graph, actual production is less than potential output. If that's the case, then unemployment is greater than the natural rate. If output is less than potential output, actual unemployment is less than the natural rate of unemployment. And as we can see, this implies that we have an excess supply of labor, and wages and prices are going to fall. Now once wages and prices start to fall, we're no longer in the short run anymore, and when wages fall, the short run average supply curve starts to shift. Labor gets cheaper, and so the cost of production goes down, so the short run average supply curve shifts down. And so you can see, anytime output is below potential output, the short run average supply curve eventually starts to shift down. And that's going to continue until actual output equals potential output. So this is the automatic adjustment to the long run equilibrium, where output equals potential output, and employment equals full employment, and the unemployment rate equals the natural rate of unemployment. So this is how an economy recovers from a downturn on its own. We can tell the same story if we see actual output above potential output. Here the short run average supply curve is crossing the aggregate demand curve, where output is greater than potential output. Now we know that unemployment is less than the natural rate of unemployment. Now, if that's the case, wages and prices are going to start to rise. Again, this is once we leave the short run. So in the short run, we can have an actual output greater than potential output. Eventually, prices and wages will start to rise, and that's going to shift the aggregate supply curve up, and that shift will continue until we get output back to potential output. Now, this is how the economy automatically recovers from a boom where output is too high. So in either case, output less than potential output or output greater than potential output, we're going to see wages and prices adjust eventually, and we'll get back to potential output. So in summary, if output is less than full employment, prices will fall as the economy returns to full employment. If output exceeds full employment, prices will rise, and output will fall back to full employment. Now this brings up an interesting question. Suppose we're in a recession where output is less than potential output. There's two solutions we could look at. One, we could do active policy. We could do expansionary monetary or fiscal policy that shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, increasing output and increasing prices slightly. Or we could do nothing and let the economy adjust on its own down to point B, where the short run average supply curve would shift down and get us a new equilibrium at potential output. So in either case, we get back to potential output and the unemployment rate back to the natural rate of unemployment. The question is the speed of adjustment. If you think the automatic adjustment is going to take a long time, well, then you would be an advocate for active policy. If you think the adjustment is very fast and very quick, well, then you might say, let's do nothing and let's let the economy take care of itself.